back to this I-24 News Evening Edition. I'm David Matlin, and this is the Daily Debate. Well, in 1994, then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin won the Nobel Peace Prize together with Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat after signing the Oslo Accords. Well, the beginning of a roadmap to peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Rabin was also responsible for signing peace between Israel and Jordan that same year. Well, the Palestinian peace process all but came to a halt in 1995 when Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli extremist, altering the political landscape from then on. Well, joining me tonight to discuss how the assassination changed the face of Israeli politics and the peace process with the Palestinians is Jacob Eilon, a senior Israeli news anchor who reported on the death of Prime Minister Rabin, and Professor Yossi Shain, the chairman of political science at Tel Aviv University and a professor of government at Georgetown University. Welcome to you both.
Welcome.
Well, Jacob, I have to start with you. You were covering the news that night, the night that this happened, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. Walk us through that a little bit.
Right. The night we never thought would happen. The event we never thought we would cover in our lifetime, certainly not myself. And then it happened. Most dramatic night, traumatic and dramatic. We went through what happened at the square in the middle of Tel Aviv, what happened at the hospital. And then I thought it was 9:15 when we actually pronounced the Prime Minister dead on live television. Probably the most dramatic broadcast ever on Israeli television, certainly my own, which I was involved with, many dramatic news events here in Israel for the past 20 years, but nothing like the death of a prime minister and the major blow to Israeli society right after that.
Right after Oslo, Israelis and Palestinians seem closer than ever, actually, to a peace agreement. To attaining peace, I guess we should say. If Rabin were alive today, what do you think the region would look like, Professor Shain?
First of all, it's very difficult to speculate what the region will look today, but I just would like to say, one has to look at this event as really the sine qua non event of the challenge to Israeli democracy. And that's the key issue. Regarding to Oslo, we can say a few words after that. Certainly it impacted the whole process. But nonetheless, the very big issue here is the issue of Israel's democracy. And as Yaakov described it, I was there as well during that night. The trauma that the Israeli society went through, the very essence of Israeli democracy was hit that night. It was so severe that I'm a bit surprised that we have recovered. How much we have recovered is a different story, because this issue is not gone away. We have recovered for a variety of reasons. First of all, the strength of the system, the institutions, etc. But one should not ever underestimate what it did to the Israeli psyche and what it did to the Israeli political arena. If I may, regarding to the Oslo process from the beginning, one has to remember, Rabin was skeptical about the process itself, even though he was pushing forward with Shimon Peres. The shifts that took place in the Israeli political society, as opposed to the Israeli society at large, were mainly during the march following the assassination of 1996, when the suicide bombing started to take place, when the bombing, especially here in Dizengoff in Tel Aviv, took place. 2 of my students were killed that day. That had a tremendous impact on the Israeli public. And this, in and of itself, made a shift in the mind of Israelis. But nevertheless, the Israeli government, including Netanyahu, was elected that elections in May, remember, continued the negotiations, notwithstanding the reluctance. So the collapse, of course, came only later, after Ehud Barak and Arafat went again, and that was the second intifada. So I know we like to say this happened and the whole thing collapsed, but it doesn't work that way. Lots of things happened in between, and there were also other seminal events that basically one should look at and see, okay, this is the watershed. And in my opinion, the watershed was not Rabin assassination in terms of Oslo, but rather the second intifada.
It's a question for both of you here. What makes history? The men or the events? I mean, in this situation, we're looking at a little bit of both, perhaps, but what's more influential on the course of history here?
Do we ever know the answer to that? I totally agree with what the honorable guest said here. There's always the other side of the equation. It's not only the Rabin's part of the story, there's the Palestinian side of the story. And what happened right after the assassination was this huge wave of terrorism, of suicide bombings in Tel Aviv. That had an enormous effect on Israeli politics. Shimon Peres will tell you that. I mean, he still thinks that everybody conspired behind his back to remove him from his post as acting prime minister, trying to get reelected. And that changed the map for many, many years to come. So there's always, a turn of events. How can you ever foresee what's going to happen next? And the questions of what would have happened if, Rabin was still a prime minister at the time, and so forth. It's very hard. Back to your question, events and people. Probably people make the events, but sometimes events, have their own existence.
Professor Shain, your thoughts on that?
Look, it is clear that Rabin's election in 1992 were a shift in the Israeli political arena. One could not envision Prime Minister Shamir at the time negotiating with Arafat or opening the channel to the PLO as Shimon Peres via his own people, initially without the knowledge of Rabin, but eventually with the knowledge and the blessing of Rabin, opening the door to these negotiations of Ron Pundak's book, of what we heard right now, and of course eventually Uri Savir and others joining the negotiations. Rabin was committed to, before the 1992 elections, to reach an agreement with the Palestinians, as he declared, within a year. And indeed, he pushed forward on this agenda, notwithstanding his reluctance to move with the PLO initially, but he pushed forward and was looking for all avenues. He was taken, I would say, by this notion that we have to invest domestically. And Rabin wanted to shift the agenda for the war to the issues of peace and the domestic arena. And everybody is hailing Rabin for really shifting sort of like the allocation of goods in the society, the distribution of money in the government. Many people are remembering this government as a government that really invests in society rather than in the war. Rabin was a very important figure. He was a figure with tremendous stature as a soldier and as a man who could be trusted, as a man who will not compromise Israel's security because of his long-term experience, as a man who was the chief of staff, minister of defense, etc., all those trophies, and a former prime minister, and certainly his stature was essential at that point. That's why he was elected and not Peres in 1992.
And potentially put him in the position to even take the moves that were taken, the difficult moves. We alluded to some of the events that happened right after the assassination, the upswing in terror attacks and things that have affected the Israeli population here. Some would argue that today peace is further away than ever. Would you agree with that statement, either of you?
I'll tell you this. There's, supposedly, there are supposedly negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. I'm saying supposedly because in the political circles here in Israel, very few believe that something will come out of this. But as soon as something does come up, an agreement, a roadmap, land for peace, all hell is going to break loose again. I think that 18 years later, you'll see the same rhetoric, and unfortunately, I think you might see some of similar actions also.
So it sounds like you're arguing that less has actually changed in these 18 years than perhaps we feel or see, that actually it's a similar situation still.
Yeah, if you ask me if this kind of thing can happen again, I think the short answer is definitely yes. It could happen again.
Professor Shain, any thoughts on that?
Look, I think that the political shifts that have taken place since Oslo are interesting. And they're interesting, again, not necessarily just because of the assassination, which I said, of course, is its magnitude one should not underestimate. It's the shift that took place in Israeli politics itself. Israeli politics changed really dramatically as a result of the Second Intifada and the shift that Sharon himself made in the creation of Kadima. the move to the center by the right-wing guru at the time, the man who was basically perceived as the nemesis of Rabin, ideologically speaking, even though they were close to each other, moved and understood that we have to move into the two-state solution. His rival, but nevertheless the man who inherited the chair of Sharon eventually, Netanyahu, and prior to that, of course, Olmert, all of whom came to the kind of like recognition that we need a two-state solution. Each and one of them is maneuvering in a different fashion. So we have come really a long way with the understanding that we are in the need of a two-state solution. Whether we can accomplish it, to what extent there are still hazardous sort of materials on the road. Everybody, I think, in the government, including Netanyahu, understand that there is no escape from it. You cannot talk about the greater land of Israel. This language disappeared, and the Israeli left disappear, was left alone completely.
But the question is, who are we? When you say we have come, who are we? I think that also a lot of things did not change, really. Israeli society is still deeply divided on this line of politics and ideology and land for peace. Deeply divided. It's just subdued right now.
Is there still a will among the Israeli population for peace, for a two-state solution?
Well, it depends who you ask. Depends who you're asking. The right-wing, extreme right-wing factions in Israeli politics are still there. As we speak today, by the way, 11 yeshiva students were arraigned in Jerusalem, I think, for terrorist acts, allegedly, against Palestinians. So this kind of extremism that is maybe a little subdued right now because nothing is really happening, but you can imagine what's going to happen as soon as we're going to have this debate back in the front page and major headlines here in Israel. And I don't think much has changed.
You speak a little bit about the extremist element here. I think it's important to note that the assassin himself, Yigal Amir, imprisoned for life now, but a minority exists here, a minority of Israelis exist who view him unabashedly as a hero here and actually call for his release. What does that say about this issue in general, that it's still in some ways acceptable in some social circle to come out and say such a thing?
There's a minority of extreme right-wing, group of people that for them, Yigal Amir, the assassin, was a hero and will still be. And this is the kind of place you should look for in the future for similar acts.
Professor Shain.
Look, the fact that we have here in Israel, I wouldn't call them extreme, criminals on the issues on the front line of Israel regarding politics is self-evident. We have them with Tag Mechir, which is sort of like this activities of terrorism against Palestinians, provocative, people who are disobeying the law, people who have a creed, which is a religious creed, as in the case of Rabin, and people who are committed to obstruct the government's orders. The key factor, however, is of course what are the deals. One thing that Oslo did not have is a clear deal. It was kind of a prolonged process, an open-ended process in the end. People understood what it should be, but there were no actions on the field. Since Oslo, however, Sharon evacuated Sinai. Don't forget that. It was traumatic, but he evacuated...
The Gaza Strip, you mean.
The Gaza Strip, sorry. Yep. I said Sinai, I regret. The Gaza Strip. And it was traumatic, but he did so. You need strong leadership, you need strong coalition, you need strong really commitment. And what you don't have right now is this, both leadership in Israel, but also the other side. To what extent they really can control, have effective monopoly over the means of violence, as we say. The experience of Gaza is also telling for many Israelis that one has to be careful. So we have here those in our midst who are certainly up to the trouble, as we say, and those who are in our enemy's field who are not ready yet. And this is a very difficult thing to...
Thank you for your sentiments here. I wish we had more time to continue this debate. Unfortunately, that's all we have here for today. A very heavy topic here for Israelis in general, and thank you both for coming here and sharing your thoughts on the subject. And that is all for our daily debate. Stay tuned here for more from the evening edition with our one-on-one interview segment.